In part 1, I looked at what people mean by control, barrier, safeguard, and critical control. But identifying a control is just the beginning. An expected control can still be absent from the work, incorrectly installed, degraded or unsuitable, or unable to perform its intended function. In part 2, I explore a different question. What evidence gives us reasonable confidence that a control will work when it's needed? Part 3 looks at human factors and human performance in barrier and control systems. And part 4 explores a more critical view of barriers and work and human performance from the safety to and hot perspective. G'day everyone, welcome to Safe As. I'm Dr. Ben Hutchinson. Please like, comment, subscribe and share. Now first, there's so many studies and guides on these topics that I can't cover everything, but check out my blog. This compendium has over 100 studies on barriers and control approaches, among other articles. For simplicity, I'll refer to the differing terminology simply as a control, unless I need to delve into specifics. The first source is the 2026 ICMM Critical Control Management Good Practice Guide. The guide presents critical control management as a layered process, including identifying fatal hazards, identifying controls, selecting critical controls, defining performance, and more. Now, a common temptation is to simply identify a control and really just move on to checking whether it's present, just doing the work. Per this guide, before verification, we must first define what acceptable performance looks like. First, describe what the control must achieve and how. The guide's example of energy isolation describes the objective as preventing exposure to a fatal energy source by ensuring energy sources are positively isolated, locked out, tagged out, and verified as isolated. The guide then requires standards or criteria against which the control can be implemented and verified. The guide says these requirements should be specific rather than vague, measurable wherever possible, and realistic in the operating context. The control objective, performance requirements, supporting activities, and verification activities are brought together in a critical control performance specification, also referred to as a summary sheet or performance standard. The performance standard translates the broader safety constraint into testable requirements for the particular control. The guide also asks what could cause a control to stop working. Now, it refers to these as erosion factors, conditions that may undermine or reduce the effectiveness of a control. You might be familiar with other barrier system terms like degradation or escalation factors. Now, these are similar, but they aren't always identical. Some also refer to this process as barrier decay or degradation. The PDS doc shown on screen distinguishes between technical influence factors or PIFs and human performance shaping factors. The technical performance influencing factors are the physical or systemic conditions that dictate whether a piece of equipment or a technical system will function as designed. These aren't the barriers themselves, but they're the conditions of success for that barrier. They include environmental stresses like temperature, vibration, or moisture that can lead to premature hardware failure. There's maintenance integrity, like the quality and frequency of testing and calibration, and systemic support, as in having accurate, up-to-date documents, etc. These things contribute to assuring the performance of technical barriers. And next, the human performance shaping factors are the human, workplace, or contextual factors that have a significant effect on how reliably an operator or crew performs a safety critical task in relation to the barrier. These can also be seen as precursors that drive behavior. I'll expand on these more in the next video, but they include individual factors, fatigue, and external factors like the context of the job, productivity pressure, organizational factors, and more. An example of how these extend our descriptions beyond just saying that a control failed, or the valve failed because the operator was too exhausted or maybe too rushed to be able to respond to the alarm. Now, shown here is an example bow tie from the Chartered Institute of Ergonomics and Human Factors. The top event is the loss of control of the load with a threat line of lift exceeding the crane capacity. Two organizational barriers are listed: planning and lifting procedure, and alarm and operator procedure. I don't think a procedure is a really good example of a full barrier, nor would it meet the ICMM's control definition. But it's just an example they list, so let's move on. We can see a degradation factor, some type of operator error that could cause the procedure to fail in this context, or the use of the procedure. They list 6 safeguards. In this context, types of degradation controls to maintain the health of the barrier in the face of some sort of operator error that could cause the procedure used to fail in that context. So again, don't focus on the procedure itself as a barrier or type of control, but rather the logics of how you specify the factor that may degrade the barrier or control's effectiveness, shown down the bottom of the bow tie escalation line, and the factors that maintain the barrier's effectiveness. The ICMM guide recommends asking 3 questions. What can cause a control not to work? How has the control failed previously? What changes could affect the control's effectiveness in the future? For a human action control, erosion factors may include a whole range of things like workload or distraction, the inadequate procedures or work instructions, desensitization to alarms or signs, and inadequate competence or skills. But any of these examples are probably a little too vague in themselves to count as adequate erosion factors, so they're indicative only. For an engineered or physical control, examples include inadequate design, damage or defects, wear or corrosion, and the loss of a required service such as power. Again, just quick examples, but too vague to be operationally sufficient, probably in a lot of safety critical contexts. A control combining a human action and an engineered object may share erosion factors from both categories. We'll explore how the real world affects these rather mechanistic frameworks in a later episode. But this kind of highlights the importance of supporting activities like inspection for corrosion, maintenance, and alarm testing. While such tasks may be essential, they shouldn't automatically be counted as independent controls. Their role may be to prevent, detect, or manage erosion of the actual control. In the ICMM's example bow tie, the erosion factor threatens the control, while a support activity is used to manage that erosion. The ICMM also distinguishes the control from the activity used to verify it. Checking in isolation isn't the same function as isolating the energy, nor is inspecting a physical barrier the same as physically separating people from a fatal hazard. This avoids counting support and assurance activities as though each provides another independent layer of protection. They provide examples of support activities like plans, risk assessment, training, maintenance, and monitoring. For them, support activities may also go by other terms like control supports, erosion controls, or supporting systems. Supporting activities are sources of info that support or enable the control to perform as expected, as in, they maximize the health of the control or minimize erosion. The guide also distinguishes more frequent in-field verification from more periodic system-level verifications. System verifications may be completed by some nominated personnel like risk and control owners, business leaders and specialists at nominated frequencies like quarterly or annually, sort of more ad hoc, or conversely, in-field verifications are more frequently undertaken based on the risk. They're the more common ones that happen on an ongoing basis. The PDS guidance adds an important distinction between current status and demonstrated performance. A field check may show that a control is available now. Recent tests, defects, and maintenance history provide more of a medium-term view, and longer-term evidence is needed to determine whether a control population consistently meets its reliability or availability requirements. No single inspection, dashboard, or lagging measure answers all 3 questions all the time. Now, verification assesses whether the control currently meets its specified requirements. Evaluation draws on accumulated evidence to determine whether the control remains effective and what needs to change. Verification also needs a decision pathway. If a critical control is absent, degraded, or uncertain, the response shouldn't end with just recording the finding in an investigation or an inspection. The PDS guidance says the organisation should consider the criticality of the impaired control, the remaining redundancy, whether key operating assumptions have been violated, how long the impairment may last, and whether effective compensating measures are available. Hopkins has referred to this critical process as pulling the trigger to challenge how controls function in practice under real or realistic scenarios. Scenario-based auditing takes a similar approach. Control independence is also important. The PDS guidance warns that barrier management can focus too narrowly on individual barriers. Several controls may share the same power supply, the same information, procedure, supervisor, maintenance process, or organizational conditions. A single fault or systemic weakness may therefore degrade several apparently separate controls at once. We also need to ask whether controls can fail together and what protects the integrity of the barrier system as a whole. This relates to the concept of common failure modes and the fallacy of independence. Many major accidents have shown barriers believed to be independent had critical interdependencies with other processes or failure types, which therefore failed as a cascade. There's also the fallacy of social redundancy, the false belief that adding more people or double checks will automatically make things safer. We'll revisit this in episode 4. Erosion doesn't only affect the control. The verification process may also degrade over time. Leveson argues that assurance must continue across the system lifecycle, checking whether the assumptions behind the original safety analysis or the design remain accurate as the system and its environment change. PDS similarly requires a barrier to remain linked to the performance requirements and design assumptions for each barrier element. A verification can therefore continue on its schedule while becoming increasingly ceremonial. The form is completed, but the check no longer tests the control's current function, the changed operating conditions, or the original assumptions. For Leveson, we should monitor the assumptions that made the control credible in the first place. These may concern the hazard, the control's expected effectiveness, how the work will be performed, the operating environment, human behavior, supporting systems, communication, and management responsibilities. For instance, some assumptions may be wrong or unrealistic from the outset. Others might drift over time as equipment, work practices, organizations, or the operating conditions change. A drift into failure can be a slow, largely invisible decoupling between reality and belief. Each important assumption can then be linked to an indicator specifying what will be checked, how and when it will be checked, and what action follows if the assumption weakens or fails. In other words, triggers. The indicator program also needs periodic review. If an incident wasn't preceded by a warning, or a warning was detected but not acted on, the indicators and the process behind them should be revised. This shifts assurance from repeatedly confirming that the control exists to exploring whether the conditions that make it effective still hold. I'm not going into indicators in this series, but check out my previous video on risk control system indicators. So verification itself needs periodic review. Are we still testing the required control performance? And does the evidence still support the decisions we're making? I covered a lot of this in part 1, but to recap the ICMM's process, starting at the selection of controls, we determine whether a measure qualifies as a control. They provide the following decision criteria. First, assessing whether it's a physical object, human action, or a combination of both. Second, whether it directly prevents an unwanted event or mitigates its consequence. And third, whether its required performance can be specified, measured, and verified. If it fails any of these checks, it's not a control. Controls are classified into 3 distinct types. As I just said, an object, which is a physical device or equipment designed to prevent an event or mitigate its consequences without human action, apart from design, installation, and maintenance. There's a human action, which is an intentional act or what a person does or doesn't do, and a combination of object and action or system, which requires both elements to function together, such as connecting a safety harness to an approved anchor point or executing an energy isolation. Beyond controls, they distinguish supporting activities such as your plans and procedures, training and maintenance that enable controls and minimize erosion. And this is separate from verification, which are the checks confirming that the controls are performing as required in practice. I've already covered this. Finally, they establish a critical control, being a subset of controls that are crucial to directly preventing an unwanted event or mitigating its consequences, or where it prevents or detects the event's escalation. Its criticality is based on several criteria like whether it's the only barrier, whether it's effective for multiple risks, and whether it's independent. If it meets these criteria, then it's a critical control. The next source is Matthew Hallowell's book, Energy-Based Safety. The book overlaps with the ICMM in many ways, but it starts from a different point. In my view at least. The ICMM begins with a fatal hazard or unwanted event, then asks which controls are crucial to managing that scenario. The energy-based safety begins with hazardous energy and asks whether high energy exposure has adequate control. The book largely provides this sequence. use the energy wheel to identify energy sources, identify which hazards meet the high energy criteria, determine whether each high energy hazard has a direct control. Where no direct control is feasible, examine the alternative control system. Now, the energy wheel provides a structured method for identifying physical energy sources rather than relying on unaided judgment. But note its bias towards largely acute physical hazards, and not necessarily long-term chronic health or psychosocial factors, nor more from the systems element, how hazards interact. So buyer beware. Every model or framework we adopt has its own assumptions, limitations, and boundary conditions. The framework separates high energy hazards from lower energy hazards. Now, research underpinning these energy-based approaches uses more than 1500 joules as the general threshold for high physical energy, as in hazard exposures at or exceeding 1500 joules are more likely to be fatal or severe, with some nuances of course. In part 1 we introduced direct controls. As a reminder, a direct control is targeted at the high energy source, reduces the energy to a level where a serious or fatal injury is no longer the most likely outcome, and continues to protect despite an unrelated, unintentional human error or variability, however you want to define it. An absolute direct control removes exposure to the hazardous energy. A mitigating direct control reduces the energy transfer without removing the interaction completely. And while procedures and permits are potentially important, they don't directly address the energy exposure itself. The framework also recognizes that not every high energy hazard has a feasible direct control. Where energy can't be controlled directly, protection may need to come from an alternative control system. Alternative controls include a combination of at least two of either physical obstacle, dedicated monitoring, or visual reminder, with a set of rules on how to use these. The book also cautions that every control is vulnerable to mistakes. Every component of a direct control must function effectively, and not every high energy hazard has a direct control. These points connect directly with erosion factors. A direct control may be strong in principle, but its protection can still depend on the correct design, installation, configuration, use and verification, among other factors. The next paper is a 2025 case study by Inato and Mora, describing how Rio Tinto standardized bow tie-based critical control management across mining and minerals processing. Rio Tinto had already used bow ties for more than a decade and critical control management for 5 years. The problem was inconsistent definitions, inconsistent bow tie formats and applications, and inconsistent reporting on control effectiveness across the business. The paper defines the top event as the point where control or containment of the hazard is lost. No surprises for anyone. It should still be recoverable and shouldn't restate the consequence. For instance, for slope hazards, changing the top event from slope failure to unplanned slope instability drew attention to controls available before instability developed into an incident. So it skewed it towards the left. If the top event is placed too late, the bow tie may conceal opportunities to detect and respond to deteriorating conditions. Now, Rio Tinto tightened its control definition by asking whether a measure can, of itself, prevent the top event or mitigate its consequence. The control may involve an object, technological system, human action, or a combination, but its performance must also be specifiable, measurable, and auditable. Detect, decide, and act was used to test whether the complete control function had been described. We covered that in part 1, so I won't repeat it. The paper then separates the control, which directly prevents or mitigates the event, and erosion control, which we discussed earlier, which maintains the control's health, and verification, which checks whether the control is implemented or functioning. For example, a high-level alarm combined with operator response can prevent overfilling. Maintenance of the alarm isn't another control against overfilling. It's an erosion control that helps keep the alarm available. Plans are treated similarly. A plan generally doesn't prevent the event by itself, if at all. The control is the action within the plan that performs the prevention or mitigation function. Applying these distinctions resulted in many measures previously called controls being reclassified as erosion controls, reducing and clarifying the group set of controls. A preventative control may be critical if it can independently stop initiation of the cause leading to the top event. A mitigative control can be critical if it can independently reduce the magnitude of the consequence. Where independence can't be established, Rio Tinto asks whether incident or near-miss evidence shows that absence or failure of the control significantly increases risk, but noting limitations of relying on generally relatively infrequent outcome measures like incidents. It's noted that this revised approach reduced the number of critical controls identified and the number of field verifications by up to 40%. This highlights that a useful critical control program doesn't produce the longest control list. It identifies the controls that genuinely manage that failure pathway, defines how they must perform, separates them from the activities that maintain or verify them, and connects them to the systems used by the frontline. The next source is the 2022 study by Selleck et al., determining the reliability of critical controls in construction projects. This study explores largely two questions. Was the critical control implemented? If it was implemented, was it effective? Now first, for context, not based on this study, but based on a prior report, 20 years of fatal mining accidents from the Brady Review revealed that less than 30% of controls implemented following a serious accident were so-called hard controls. Administrative controls were the dominant control in most serious cases. Further, in 45% of cases, a control was used but wasn't effective. In 36% of cases, the hazard was unidentified. So a control may be appropriate but not implemented, or implemented but not used. Or it may be implemented but remain ineffective under the encountered conditions. Now with that out of the way, moving into Selleck's study in construction, across the controls analysed in their sample, there was average implementation was 57% of the controls, average effectiveness of 41%, and a combined reliability of just 23%. They found a high proportion of weakly implemented or absent critical controls, and hence the predominant safety approaches weren't effective at preventing the release of hazardous energies. Critical controls rated as weak were considered unreliable, as they failed more times than they were effective. As a proviso, the data came from incident investigation records, instances when something bad happened, so shouldn't be interpreted as the everyday failure or reliability probability of all construction controls during everyday work. But still interesting. The Selleck study also suggests a useful addition to investigations and learning. Don't just try to identify causal or contributory factors, but map those factors directly back to your critical control standards to see if the control itself was the right choice for that hazard. And overall, a fairly obvious conclusion: while the presence of a control is necessary for its functioning, presence alone isn't confidence of effectiveness or suitability. Now, to measure this effectively, Hallowell suggests the Hecker assessment. In essence, providing a success to exposure ratio. Instead of counting injuries, we count how often high energy work is performed with a direct control in place. This gives us insights into our actual capacity to target the energy that kills within a very narrow sort of window of learning about normal work. The final study is the 2026 paper by Baena et al. Titled Balanced Approach to Serious Injury and Fatality Prevention. The researchers analysed field assessments and injury records from 31 utility and construction organisations. They start by unpacking the measurement problem in safety. If safety is defined as the capacity to control critical hazards, one definition among many of course, then injury rates alone don't directly measure that capacity. They describe how past outcomes can obscure the conditions associated with serious injuries and fatalities when used in isolation, as in trying to overinterpret our incidents to how the normal work and how people actually interact with hazardous energies and hazardous conditions. The study therefore examines three different views of safety performance. Inputs, as in proactive activities intended to influence future work. Monitoring, which is the current conditions of the work system. And outputs, the past results, including injury rates. In this study, pre-job safety brief quality is the input, the high energy control assessment, HECA, is the monitoring measure, and injury and SIF rates are the longer term outputs. And the measures answer different questions. A pre-job brief examines the quality of planning and engagement before the task. HECA measures the proportion of observed high energy hazards that have a corresponding direct control. And the outputs, of course, measure incidents and other relatively infrequent events. The study found a positive relationship between pre-job safety brief quality and HECA. Organisations conducting more structured and engaged pre-job safety briefs tended to have a greater proportion of direct controls present for the observed high energy hazards. Each percentage point increase in briefing quality was associated with a 0.5 percentage point increase in the HECA scores, holding worker hours constant. The study also found that higher HECA scores were associated with fewer longer-term SIFs. Each percentage point increase in HECA was associated with a 3% reduction in the expected number of SIFs, again holding worker hours constant. Importantly though, this relationship was correlational, not causal. It doesn't show that deliberately raising the HECA scores will cause SIFs to fall. Rather, it suggests that organizations with stronger observed direct control coverage tended to experience fewer serious and fatal injuries over the longer term. The authors recommend combining input, monitoring, and outcome measures rather than relying on one type of indicator in isolation. So I've covered a lot. What can we make of the findings? Across all these sources, a control moves through several stages. 1. Being identified. The control is identified in a risk assessment bow tie or control register. At this stage, it's more of an intention rather than evidence of protection. 2. Being specified. Its objective, performance requirements, and failure criteria are defined, along with the erosion factors that could undermine it and the supporting activities needed to preserve it. 3. Implementation. The control is present, installed, or performed where the exposure occurs. 4. Verification. Evidence shows it can deliver its required function under the relevant conditions and currently meets its performance requirements. Monitored. We need to know whether it fulfills its function, preferably as close to real-time or realistic scenarios as possible. 6. Improvement. The verification results, incidents, and operational experience are used to identify weaknesses and strengthen the control over time. Per Holnagel, a barrier isn't simply working or failed. It might act too late for too short a time with insufficient capacity, in the wrong sequence, or on the wrong object. Verification must test the required function, not merely confirm that something bad happened. And per Leveson, we should consider and validate assumptions over the life cycle. Further, Holnagel evaluates barrier quality more broadly than asking whether the control is just effective. He considers things like how well it achieves its purpose, the resources needed to design and maintain it, its robustness to environmental variability, how long it takes to implement, whether it suits safety critical work, it's available when needed, how easily its performance can be evaluated, and whether it depends on human action during operation. This exposes a type of design trade-off. A rule might be cheap and quick to introduce, but difficult to assure and entirely dependent on people knowing and following it. A physical barrier may take longer to implement and cost more ultimately, but deliver its function with less operational dependence. I also like how Harms-Ringdahl and Rollenhagen, in their 2017 Safety Barriers chapter, discuss the barrier principles, noting barriers should be as simple as possible and easy to design and easy to understand design assumptions. They should cover a wide range of initiating events where possible. Design should consider conflicts from conflicting safety goals. Consider if barriers are likely to be perceived as hindrances for normal production and whether those views will lead to workarounds. Indeed, Holnagel calls this hindrance a barrier bypass. When a control obstructs workable performance, people may create another path around it. The barrier, therefore, contributes to the conditions for its own defeat. Be sensitive to human performance variability in the use and maintenance of barriers, and consider how barriers can be tested and efficiency is evaluated. And administrative barriers or safeguards, being generally expected to have lower efficiency over time, need to be consciously planned and evaluated to maintain a high efficiency over that same time frame. Harms-Ringdahl and Rollenhagen then propose these following principles. 1. Does the barrier meet its functional requirements in terms of the situations it's designed for? 2. What is the barrier's ability to execute its specified functionality when needed, as in its reliability and availability? 3. Given that the barrier executes its intended functionality when needed, to what extent can this functionality be maintained during progress of an accident scenario, as in capacity, effectiveness, and robustness to unexpected variability or incidents? For example, a bund's probably going to be pretty effective for a lot of different failure scenarios, and it doesn't rely on someone to have to notice something. But of course, it could be destroyed during an explosion. 4. How many resources are needed and how easy it is to evaluate and maintain the barrier, as in its evaluation, maintainability, or simplicity. 5. How much is the barrier dependent on human activity to realize its functionality during operation? Though overall, many controls still depend on someone detecting a condition, deciding what it means, or acting correctly. Organizations are, more or less, human enterprises. Now stay tuned for part 3, which examines the enabling conditions and human factors that build or erode safety capacities and how human performance should be specified for control performance. That's it on Safe As. Please like, comment, subscribe and share. It really helps. And link in the comments to support the channel.